actresses, actresses. So often the bane of my life, and yet they are also my divine inspiration. Naturally, I fell ridiculously head over ears in love with some of them, like a boy of 18, including the bewitching Mrs. Patrick Campbell, and of course my dear darling Ellen Terry. I've never been the same man since. Women never realize what timid creatures we men are. Sybil Thorndike is another matter, an actress and a woman of unmatched spirit, to be sure. I used to call her Sybil the Great, and so she was. I saw her play Medea and Hecuba. My goodness, what a force of nature she became. But that was later, before we worked together on my play St Joan. It was a very different pair of shoes when I first saw her act. We were about to tour Candida, my counterblast to Ibsen's A Dollhouse. I was looking for an understudy for Eileen O'Malley, playing Candida, my strong heroine. One night, I saw a face in the West End. It was the unusual flippity-gibbet nonsense, but amidst all the dross, I spotted this young actress. She was completely undisciplined, no technique, no self-control, but she was fresh and natural, and I thought she might do. I decided to audition her while we were rehearsing Candida.
Sybil auditions for Candida.
So, you decided to give me Candida's speech to the young poet, Eugene Marchbanks.
Yes, it's such a wonderful speech, so strong. It comes at the point where...
My dear girl, I know where the speech comes. I happen to be the play's author.
Oh, yes, of course. I do apologise.
Come on, let's see what you can do.
I was ecstatic with excitement. I went at it with all guns blazing. I thought, this is as easy as pie after Shakespeare. I put everything into it. Lady Macbeth, Rosalind, Beatrice, everything I knew. Now, I want you to look at this other boy. My husband, James Morell, spoiled from his cradle. You know how strong he is, how clever he is, how happy. Ask James's mother and his 3 sisters what it cost to save James the trouble of doing anything but be strong and clever and happy. Ask me what it cost to be James's mother and 3 sisters and wife and mother to his children all in one. Ask the tradesmen who want to worry James and spoil his beautiful sermons who it is that puts them off. When there is money to give, he gives it. When there is money to refuse, I refuse it. I build a castle of comfort and indulgence and love for him, and stand sentinel always to keep vulgar little cares out. And
yeah, if we just pause there a moment,
Shall we
then
stop?
we can pick that up. We'll go back. So if everybody could turn off their mobile phones, it'd be a good note, I think. Oh, sorry. Oh. Should we go again, Victoria, from Ask the Tradesman who want?
Sorry?
Victoria, could you go from Ask the Tradesman
Veronica.
who want?
Veronica.
Sorry.
go
Veronica.
from where?
Ask
Ask
the
the
Tradesman
Tradesman.
who want.
Someone's coming in.
What did she say?
Just the end of your speech, darling.
Oh,
When there
and
is money.
stand sentinel always to keep vulgar little cares out.
Stop
And-
there. Stop there. That's splendid, my dear young lady. Only you must go home now. Marry a nice young man, have 4 children, do all the housework, then come back and show me Candida again.
Oh dear, was I really that terrible?
You were, by all that's holy. You failed to capture her dignity, the largeness of her mind. But I suppose at a pinch you'll do as Ellen's understudy.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm absolutely thrilled. Candida is such a warm, lovable character.
Of course she is. Everybody loves Candida. There have been serious outbreaks of Candida mania all over the country.
They tell me you based her on Ellen Terry.
Stuff and nonsense. I certainly let Ellen read it, and she thought it heavenly, but Candida was entirely a product of my vivid imagination.
I beg your pardon.
Nor was Parson Morell based on Henry Irving, as one godforsaken fool of a critic suggested. And neither was I myself the model for Marchbanks.
I see.
Now come and watch Ellen rehearsing. She's a beautiful actress, very clever and hard-working, and the best Candida I've had yet. She's a jewel of an Irish woman, and she'll teach you a lot.
Oh, I just adore to watch her.
I felt young Sybil possessed certain qualities which that sorceress Janet A. Church had. It was for divine Janet that I wrote Candida, but she was much too strong for the part. She simply kicked it round the stage. Sybil will have the same difficulty, but if she works hard, she will get there. That is, if she learns to keep her arms below her shoulders. Luckily, she never had to go on for Ellen. She wasn't ready for Candida.
I simply adored Shaw. I was captivated from the moment we met. He had a wonderful twinkle in his eye. I sat beside him during the rehearsal while he talked in a fascinating way about acting, and especially about his memories of Mrs. Patrick Campbell, whom he called Mrs. Pat, and Ellen Terry.
Lewis auditions for widowers' houses.
On the tour, we alternated Candida with my first play, Widowers' Houses. It was a realistic exposure of slum landlordism, and it caused a sensation on its first night. Fabians and Ibsenites cheered, traditionalists booed, and I became instantly infamous. During the casting, I auditioned a promising Welsh actor called Lewis Casson to play the young hero, Harry Trench.
I greatly admired Shaw's plays before I appeared in any of them. Then came Granville Barker's famous Seasons at the Royal Court, during which I played several parts and got to know him as a director, his skill, his care and kindness, and the melodies of rhetoric his Irish ear demanded of us.
Now, Casson, please read me part of that scene young Trench has with Sartorius.
Very well. You are nothing of the sort, sir. I found out this morning from your man Lickcheese, or whatever his confounded name is, that your fortune has been made out of a parcel of unfortunate creatures that have hardly enough to keep body and soul together, made by bullying and threatening all sorts of pettifogging tyranny. You took money that ought to have fed starving children. If I'd been the father of one of those children, I'd have given you something worse than the sack. I wouldn't say a word to save your soul if you have such a thing. The point is, what sort of homes do you give them for their money? People must live somewhere, or else go to jail. Advantage is taken of that to make them pay for houses that are not fit for dogs. Why don't you build proper buildings and give fair value for the money you take?
You have a good strong voice, though you should resist the temptation to sing my words. But you caught Trench's idealism well. The part is yours.
Sybil meets Lewis.
During an evening off from Candida, I went to see Widowers' Houses in Belfast. I saw Lewis Casson's photo outside the theatre, and I thought, oh, there's a nice face, very strong and determined. I like that man. And after the performance, I said to my friend May Playfair, Casson wakes you up and makes you puzzle a bit instead of sending you to sleep as a lot of highbrow actors do. He sort of barks out things, and there's nothing actory in his acting. May said, he's a very good actor, but he's a difficult man to get on with. He's a socialist. So I thought he'd probably hate me, being a vicar's daughter and a country Jane, brought up in good old solid conservative household. But when the tour moved on to Dublin, May and I bumped into him in the Lion House at the zoo. He was wearing a shabby overcoat and hat down over his eyes. He looked as if he ought to be an engineer or a sailor rather than an actor. He was standing in front of a tigress trying to hypnotize her. At first, he only barked a huffy sort of how do you do to me, but then May made some amusing remark, and I saw his face light up and the sternness disappear. When we talked, I discovered he was fearfully highbrow and raving mad about the theatre, especially this man, Granville Barker.
Barker is a marvellously skillful director. He has a kind of youthful authority, and he's blessed with a brilliant imagination.
But why does everyone treat him like God? If he says a thing, all you highbrow actors say he's right.
That's because we respect him for the way he helps us and for not wasting time or showing off like so many directors do.
Lewis Casson argued a dreadful amount, but he was keen on heaps of things that I was too. I felt he was the sort of man I'd like for a pal. Love is such an awful effort. Being pals is much better and far more amusing.
Okay, we'll just hold it now.
So sorry.
If you just do those last lines, Veronica.
Do you want me to go over it?
Just go the last couple of
Would
lines.
everybody switch off their mobiles?
I'll just do the last speech.
Yeah, please.
Lewis Casson argued a dreadful amount, but he was keen on heaps of things that I was too. I felt he was the sort of man I'd like for a pal. Love is such an awful effort. Being pals is much better and far more amusing.
Reunion at the Gaiety.
I met him again when I joined Miss Horniman's company at the Gaiety Theatre in Manchester. I was understudying the lead actress in the comedy Clothes and the Woman, which he was in too. One day, during a break in rehearsal, he greeted me in the stalls. I was surprised he even remembered me.
May I join you, Miss Thorndike?
Why, Mr. Casson? Yes, of course.
That's a very long part you're understudying.
Oh dear, yes. I'm so fearfully anxious about it.
Perhaps I could help you. I'm very good at teaching people their parts.
Oh, would you? Oh, I'd be so grateful. I'm really struggling with it.
Why don't we work on it together?
So we did. He was most frightfully blunt. After I'd spoken my first 2 speeches, he fairly laid me low. He spoke twice as fast as I could think and made nothing but criticisms.
To begin with, you speak much too fast. No one in the gallery will have the faintest idea what you're talking about. You must think more carefully about the meaning of your words and pay attention to phrasing, intonation and pitch.
But surely...
Secondly, your movement is much too undisciplined. Stop bouncing around and waving your hands in the air. That barnstorming kind of acting is rapidly going out of fashion, thank goodness. You have to be more natural. Show more restraint.
His criticisms knocked me sideways, made me feel like a used stamp. I have a fierce temper, and he had a violent one, so we had several rows. But I decided to do what he said, because he knew much more about this new acting business than me.
I was an ardent admirer of Shaw's plays, but she knew little about them apart from Candida and Widowers' Houses, so I persuaded her to read several others and also his wonderful prefaces. I soon realized she was shockingly unaware of the world outside the theatre. I decided she needed educating.
Educating Sybil.
Manchester was full of politics then, but I knew nothing about it, except you were supposed to vote Conservative if you were respectable, and be anything but a socialist. But Lewis Casson took me to a general election meeting when Lloyd George spoke in support of the Liberal candidate Winston Churchill. He also took me round the Manchester slums. That opened my eyes and forced me to question my vicarage values. I decided not to be a Conservative anymore. It was so boring.
I assume you are at least in favour of giving women the vote.
Well, goodness, why ever do you want to go on fussing on about that? There's only just time enough to learn about acting without wanting votes and such like.
My dear Miss Thorndike, your acting won't be much good if you don't think about the world in which we live and the conditions of the people.
Oh, but there are much more exciting worlds that help me with acting.
In that case, the sooner you learn about the suffrage question, the better. Come and hear the Pankhurst speak, and you'll see what I mean.
He took me to a meeting at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, where Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter, Christine, were speaking. I thought Emmeline would be a lovely part to play on stage. She got me from the start. She was so dignified and quietly dramatic, with such well-chosen phrases. She had a voice of remarkable sweetness, and I thought she could convert anyone. Christabel was more violent and used wild arguments, too much for me, but she was exciting. Their ideas affected me deeply. I joined the Women's Social and Political Union, and after just 3 weeks, I was persuaded to chair a suffrage meeting. I felt such a fool, but I got quite worked up about women's wrongs. The trouble with being an actress is that you can make yourself feel anything at any time. But Lewis Casson wasn't fooled.
Did you believe everything you said at that meeting?
No, not really. I just got carried away.
The marriage proposal.
I soon got to know her better. We took walks in the countryside outside Manchester and found we shared a fondness for poetry, especially Keats, Shelley and Browning. We started to learn their poems by heart.
I loved his deep, melodious voice and his Welsh lilt. Once we went for a midnight walk with a couple of other actors and lay down in a cornfield under a harvest moon. On the way back, he held my hand, which I thought was very forward. He invited me to tea in his digs, and the next day for coffee and toast in the Cardoma restaurant. Then all of a sudden, he asked me to marry him. I was flabbergasted. He'd never even called me by my Christian name. I was still Miss Thorndike. The whole room spun around. I was so taken aback I didn't give him an answer immediately. But that Sunday we went to early service together, and somehow or other we found ourselves engaged.
Just before the wedding, we were in Ireland, finishing a tour of Candida in Cork. Sybil was playing Candida and I was the poet, Marchbanks. On the last night, we had to catch our train back to Dublin so as not to miss the boat to England. By sheer speed, we reduced Candida to something like an hour. People who came in late found we were already near the end of the first act. So we caught the train, we caught the boat, and we were back in England just in time for our wedding.
Shaw rehearses Sybil.
It wasn't until after the war that I finally got to play Candida in London, with Lewis directing and playing Marchbanks. I hadn't met Shaw since I understudied Ellen O'Malley. I wrote to him to get his permission to perform the play. I told him I had taken his advice and married and had 4 children. He not only gave us permission, he offered to help Lewis direct. At first, I found it hard to get Ellen's interpretation out of my head, but Shaw helped immensely. working with us with extraordinary vigour. He was most exacting, but always polite. He never made me feel uncomfortable. I finally felt I knew how to play Candida.
Now, Sybil, let's try that scene once more.
Eugene, come and sit down on the hearthrug and talk moonshine, as you usually do. You may say anything you really and truly feel. I am not afraid, as long as it is your real self that speaks, and not a mere attitude. I put you on your honour and truth. Now, what have you to say to Candida?
Nothing. But to repeat your name 1,000 times. Don't you feel that every time is a prayer to you?
Doesn't it make you happy to be able to pray?
Yes, very happy.
Well, that happiness is an answer to your prayer. Do you want anything more?
No. I have come into heaven, where want is unknown.
Sybil's a fine actress now. She's shown that during this current season in her playing of Greek tragedy, but she's still too strong for Candida.
Shaw directed us with complete understanding of what he wanted from the actors. He worked with us in the morning, and in the afternoon he rehearsed Mrs. Pat in a revival of Pygmalion. Those rehearsals sounded very different from ours.
I usually rely on my bad character as a blarneying Irishman to get me kept away from rehearsals. With Mrs. Pat, I should have arranged it better. That animal of a woman was utterly impossible as Eliza Doolittle. I'm the greatest playwright in the world, but she treated me as no dog was ever treated. I fumed over the liberties she took and her tendency to play for laughs. She had great beauty, but no delicacy or pathos whatsoever. One day she stormed out of rehearsal and played the piano for ages in her dressing room. There was a devil of a row, and I gave her an ultimatum. If she continued to play Eliza her way and not mine, the play would not open. Of course, on the night she was superb.
Shaw finds his Joan.
Soon after this, Lewis and I went into management in the West End. And then we had a wonderful idea.
We discovered that the ban on staging Shelley's poetic drama The Cenci was about to expire on the centenary of his death.
It was the story of Beatrice, a young woman tried and condemned for murdering her father, who had raped her. It had been condemned by the censor because of its themes of incest and murder and its horrific picture of evil. But I thought it was a really great play.
We decided to stage a few matinees in the West End. It would be the play's first public production for 100 years. Everyone was against the idea. All our friends said it would be a failure and we'd be ruined.
But we didn't care. The play had wonderfully dramatic moments, and I had long coveted the idea of playing Beatrice. She was only 20, and I was twice her age, but that didn't matter a jot. After all, Mrs. Pat played Eliza Doolittle when she was 19.
One night I went to see the Cenci. Afterwards I said to my wife Charlotte, I found my Joan. Now I can start that play. This came as a great surprise to her, since for some years she had been urging me to write a play about Joan. She took to leaving books around our house about Joan and her trial. But when I saw Sybil's performance and how she played Beatrice's trial scene, I knew she was the one.
A rival Joan.
Oh, my goodness.
What is it, Lewis?
That talk we had with Lawrence Binion about writing a St Joan play for us.
I'm sure it will be superb. He's such a beautiful writer. What about it?
According to the Sunday Times, Shaw too is writing a play about Joan.
Oh, no. I don't believe it. That's awful.
It seems to be true.
And I was so longing to play her.
I know, Sybil, I know, but hold on a moment. Let me think. Maybe you still can.
How?
Why don't I get in touch with Shaw, ask him if the report is true, and if it is, would he consider casting you as his Joan?
But we have an agreement with Binion.
True, that is a problem. I'll just have to explain our dilemma to Shaw and see what he says.
2 days later, we had a postcard from Shaw.
Yes, cousin, I am at work on a St Joan play. I've already finished the first act. I warned off Macefield and Drinkwater, but I forgot about Binion. Of course Sybil ought to play Joan, at least my Joan. Gladys Cooper will do for Binion's.
Oh, Lewis, this is such thrilling news. You know how for years Joan has captured my imagination. She's such an intriguing historical figure, such an enigma, and her passionate faith. She was a great military inventor, as well as a mystic and a saint. I'm sure Shaw will create a true Joan, the tough revolutionary who went down her road like a thunderbolt.
Shaw discusses the real Joan.
Over the years, I've been blowing hot and cold about the idea of a play. Then, in a museum in Orleans, I saw a remarkable sculptured head, supposedly based on Joan. It was a wonderful face, the face of a born leader. I wrote to Mrs. Pat, telling her I would write a Joan play. I would begin with the sweeping up of the cinders after her martyrdom, and continue with her arrival in heaven. I asked her if she would like to play Joan, come in on horseback in armour and fight scores of extras. But for some extraordinary reason, she declined my generous offer. What later revived my interest was the Catholic Church's decision to canonize the young girl they had once burnt at the stake.
While Shaw was working on the play, we met him one day in the lobby of the House of Commons. As soon as he saw us, he poured out a torrent of thoughts about Joan. I was transfixed.
Have you read the histories and other plays about Joan?
Yes, I have. At least the ones I could get hold of.
Well, forget them all. They're just romantic poppycock. Joan is not a melodramatic heroine, but a genius. She was neither beautiful nor pretty. No one in her village or the court or the military camp ever claimed she was. She inspired strong likes and dislikes, and she was not at all bad looking. But she had no love affairs. This was accepted by her soldier comrades as evidence of her divine mission.
I was amazed to read that she was illiterate.
Totally illiterate, but not ignorant. Although she couldn't write letters, she could dictate them. She understood the situation in France. The relief of Orleans, the coronation of the Dauphin were military and political masterstrokes. She was a woman of policy, not blind impulse. In war, she was as much a realist as Napoleon. She had his eye for artillery and what it could do.
I find that quite astonishing and thrilling.
The question is, why did she insist on a soldier's dress and arms and sword and horse and equipment, and treat her escort of soldiers as comrades, sleeping side by side with them on the floor at night, as if there was no difference between them? Because she wanted to lead a man's life. She refused to accept the traditional woman's lot, so she fought and lived as men did.
Oh, I can understand that completely.
Her family weren't rich, but there was no evidence of poverty. She was the daughter of a working farmer and worked there driving sheep to pasture and so forth. But she wasn't a hired servant. She had time to go to confession, to dawdle about waiting for visions and listen to church bells to hear voices in them.
Yes, this is all so true.
In my barbarous opinion, the conventional Joan is absurd. She has floored every previous writer about her life. Their works are no use whatsoever. So English literature must be saved by an Irishman as usual. from having nothing to show about Joan except the piffling libel in the first part of Henry VI, where that damned fool Shakespeare describes her as a witch and a strumpet.
It's a very odd portrait. I remember thinking that.
But exactly the same goes for the other counts. Schiller's Maid of Orleans is drowned in a witch's cauldron of raging romance. She has no point of contact with the real Joan. He makes her die on the battlefield, for goodness sake. It's pure romantic flapdoodle, and no sane person could mistake for sober history that wretch Voltaire's version of Joan, which was an outrage.
But what about Mark Twain's work?
Another idolatrous version. Twain worshipped Joan and tried to turn her into an unimpeachable American school teacher in armour. He claimed her trial was corrupt, her judges scoundrels, and the questions they put to her devised to trap her. Yet there is not a shred of evidence for these slanders. Her judges were as straightforward as Joan herself, trying her quite fairly, and the law took its regular course. Joan was entirely innocent, but she convicted herself every time she opened her mouth. When doctrine was at issue, she said enough to burn 50 heretics. Her excommunication was a genuine act of faith and piety, and her execution followed inevitably. The court's opinion that her visions were temptations of the devil was sincere. Those travesties make me sick. Mine will be the real Joan.
Oh, I just knew it would be.
The conventional Joan with the sad eyes, half burnt before she makes her first entrance, and reeking with pious pathos, will kill the play dead. Joan must be bright, dominantly energetic, full of fun, with no touch of sentimentality about her. She must sweep the play along whenever she is on stage, be forceful and sure from beginning to end, not a snivelling Cinderella.
That's exactly the Joan I long to play. I hate the kind of church window, holy Bob saint so many people have made of her.
I'm very glad to hear it. I want the play to be an act of justice, for which the spirit of Joan is still calling. Her words are not heresies and blasphemies to us. We sympathize with them, and she defends herself splendidly, wiping the floor with her accusers. Although she was a pious Catholic, she was in fact one of the first Protestant martyrs.
Writing the play.
This is fascinating, Shaw. So how is the play progressing?
It's in serious danger of becoming my best play yet. It's certainly been the easiest to create. I write a good deal of it on the rapidly moving trains between King's Cross and Hatfield. That is, when I can get a seat. But it's much too long, so I'm cutting it back to the bone. I dare say it'll be ready by the autumn.
We're greatly looking forward to working on it.
I read the extraordinary detailed accounts of Joan's trial and her rehabilitation, which are largely verbatim. I've used them word for word. They contain a drama that needed only arrangement for the stage, which of course was child's play for me. Joan guided my hand, and the words came tumbling out at such speed that my pen rushed across the paper. I could barely write fast enough to get them down. I owe absolutely nothing to anyone except Joan and those documents. So make your offerings at her altar, not mine.
Reading the play.
When he'd finished the play, Shaw wanted to read it to us and to Bronson Albury, with whom we were in management. So we motored down to his Hertfordshire house in the village of Ay at St Lawrence.
We had a lovely lunch first, chicken for us and all sorts of funny little things for him because he's a vegetarian. Then he took us and his wife Charlotte into their sitting room and began reading every part. From the moment Joan entered and confronted the soldier, Robert de Baudricourt, we couldn't move.
Good morning, Captain Squire. Captain, you are to give me a horse, and armour, and some soldiers, and send me to the Dauphin. And those your orders from my lord.
Orders from your lord? And who the devil may your lord be? Go back to him and tell him that I'm neither duke nor peer at his orders. I'm a squire of Bodricourt, and I take no orders except from the king.
Yes, Squire, that's all right. My lord is the King of Heaven.
Why, the girl's mad.
They all say I'm mad until I talk to them, Squire. But you see, this is the will of God. You will do what he has put in my mind.
It is the will of God that I shall send you back to your father with orders to put you under lock and key. Thrash the madness out of you. What have you to say to that?
Eventually he reached a moment on the River Loire, and that's when a miracle happened.
Seigneur, mademoiselle.
What is it? A kingfisher?
No, the wind, the wind, the wind.
The wind has changed. God has spoken.
But that's all jam. Now the real play starts.
He then launched into marvellous arguments about heresy and loyalty and nationalism. As for Joan's speeches in the cathedral and trial scenes, they were sheer poetry.
After 3 hours, he reached the epilogue, set 25 years after Joan's death. The Dauphin has a dream in which a man arrives in modern costume and announces Joan's canonization in 1920.
By the end, we were in tears and absolutely enthralled. It was a tremendous play, so daring and true. Joan was exactly as I had imagined her, strong-willed, crafty, and completely unsentimental. Shaw read it so divinely, with such a rich variety of sound. He was a wonderful actor. He knew the tune of every sentence, where to pause, what to inflect. It was like listening to a great musician who knows intuitively how every note should be played. The lines came like music. Each character was a different instrument in the orchestra, and he could play them all.
Planning rehearsals.
Now, Casson, we must talk about the directing.
I'll be very happy to take it on.
We will share the task between us.
Oh,
I will take the morning sessions, you the afternoon ones. I refuse to spend more than 3 hours a day rehearsing. I've asked John Folds to create some incidental music and Charles Ricketts to do the design and the costumes. One matter I insist on. The scenery must not be fantastic. Joan was a real person and it should reflect that reality. So should her costume. I want her to wear real chain armour that clanks as she walks, not the usual silver string concoction.
That would be all right, I'm sure.
But I can't be bothered with the business and technical side, so I'm leading all that to you, Casson.
that suits me perfectly.
There's one other matter. Some time ago I promised the New York Theatre Guild that they could have my next play, and I feel duty-bound to let them have St. Joan first for Broadway.
That seems a pity.
But we do understand, don't we, Louis?
Yes, of course we do.
They have in mind casting the young American actress Winifred Linehan as Joan. They've asked me to cut the play, but I've refused. I told them they should begin earlier or arrange later train services. I'm not in the popular entertainment business. The sort provided by the fate of Joan seems to be quite sufficiently looked after in the United States by the Ku Klux Klan, and is the more entertaining for being the real thing instead of a stage show.
Casting the play.
Have you had time to look at my casting ideas?
I have indeed. I think we may jump at Ernest Thesiger for the Dauphin. He is the most difficult to cast because you need a comedian who can be a creditable, zany fellow and at the same time a creditable scion of the House of Valois. We must find a part for Raymond Massey, and young Jack Hawkins would certainly do for Dunois' Page. Oh, for heaven's sake, don't let's give that role to a woman. And make her like the principal boy in a pantomime.
You will see that I've suggested myself Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais.
Now that would be a mistake. You're not wicked enough to play him. It's also too large a part when you're also directing with me. But you could play the chaplain de Stoggenburg, which is a sensationally effective part. It has been puzzling me more than any of the others. I have seriously thought of asking Sybil to double it while she's being burnt at the stake.
Oh, that would be fun.
But quite difficult to stage.
Now, I don't want the company to learn their parts until the end of our first week of rehearsing. Nothing is a greater nuisance than actors trying to remember their lines instead of settling their positions and getting the hang of the play with the book in their hand. In the second week, I will get off the stage and let you play without interruption.
So thank you, cast one.